I hope everyone can see this in full screen.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So very good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure again to meet you all today. Today, the topic we will be discussing are two important topics today. First is human ecology and another is environment and human relationships. So both of these are very important takeoffs from where we left the last time. That is the introduction to society and culture and how sustainability relates to society and culture. Understanding human ecology is very, very important from the aspect of understanding sustainability. But first of all, we start with this slide. We try to understand what is the actual position of humans, right? Are they taxonomically unique or are they ecologically unique? If you see the taxonomic hierarchy of human beings, that is Homo sapiens, which is shown in the box below, it shows that humans are just one part of the animal kingdom, right? They can be placed or classified in the taxonomic group as from, as a species of animals, basically. And it is very interesting to see, as is like, humans are sharing the space with a lot of other organisms, but taxonomically, they seem to be a little unique. So if we look at the graph above, which shows the development in the brain capacity versus the time that has passed in the history of human beings, it's very interesting to note, if you will see, right from the start of where the graph begins with Australopithecus affarensis up to where it ends in Homo sapiens, the brain sizes or the capacity has changed considerably over millions of years. And the taxonomic identity that humans have achieved is attributed largely due to the presence or the development processes of this human capacity itself. So actually, there are two different arguments which place humans in their equation with their environment. As you know, there are two significant arguments whether this is a biologically induced mechanism or is it a non-biologically induced mechanism. So we have seen that brain capacity has actually developed or increased, but that make a difference. So the biological approach, those who propose this, they say, or they argue rather, that the biology unites humans with ecology in ways because the development of biology or development of brain capacity and the other facilities, those facultative mechanisms actually brought about the way in which humans relate with their environment in much better ways. But if you see, there are another set of people who say that the non-biological approach is what makes sense, because it's not just the biological development or the organization in humans, but the argument that the social as well as the biological and ecological aspects together, they cannot be unified, because the social aspect has brought these changes to the biological organization of the brain itself. So there are two perspectives that we see in what is known as human ecology, and taking this forward, we can understand now that there is a distinct argument between whether human ecology is a science which is mostly based on bioecology or is it more of sociology. The concept of biologism, okay, that says that the basis here is to understand human relationships with environment on a biological basis. It's not just biology, it is bioecology, because there is underpinning principles of ecology which dictate how the biology of organisms respond to the environment, especially in terms of the behavior, the relationships, and the functions of humans. So here we see that there are several ecological components, okay, which actually determine how human ecology illustrates the environment's place in humans' lives and the human's place within a given environment. So here you see niche, habitats. These are very important ecological concepts which define where a human being or a non-human, for that matter, where they are actually present. But there are processes such as competition, Succession, commensalism, dominance, or symbiosis, these are all ecological functionalities which define how the humans actually react to their environment. So when we look at it, again, these two arguments make sense for us. So what we are thinking of in terms of human ecology, is human ecology a biological study or a non-biological study? Predominantly, because although there is the component or the perspective of place or niche, which is more ecological in character, what defines the relationship becomes more of a social nature. So is then the human ecology that we are proposing to study today, is it an asocial or a social phenomenon? Now, if we look at competition, it gives us some clue to the study of humans' ecological connection, right? So what is very important here is that we should understand the difference between competition and struggle. So this has been defined in many ways, and it is actually defined or based on its utility as a means to promote evolution of humans itself. So here, if we say struggle is largely recognized as the law of biological nature and the circumstance which is leading to some formation of some sort of order. So there is a struggle. That it means that from an ambient state, there is some sort of a disorder which leads to organization, and that leads to formation of a secondary order or an alternate order, if we will think of it. But competition means it's a process where individuals or units affect one another through a supply of materials and their sustenance. So it means that the order here is established at the cost of one or more other ecological units or trophic members or individuals. So here, so the struggle between the differences between struggle and competition is very interesting perspective to look at whether human ecology is more of a biological science or an ecological science. Here, as we see, whenever there is a struggle for resources, the competition or the strongest in its strongest sense leads to appropriation of supply of materials and their future sustenance for the present generation. But the struggle itself is a continual process, and this process continually will affect several other generations. So ecologically, this means that human ecology in the perspective of competition becomes a biological phenomenon. But we understand that competition is not unique to humans, as also animals also exhibit the same. So within the perspective of human ecology, we can say that this is not a specialized core to understand how actually humans are uniquely placed within a given environment. So competition or struggle by which all disorder and reclamation of order is maintained in nature, it may not actually be only a biological phenomenon, but more of a social phenomenon, which brings this struggle or competition a unique identity. So here actually unique need not be positive. We should understand that. So we should also understand that human ecology, as we have discussed now, is some study which will include both external and internal mechanisms. So this evolution of our thought now to the understanding that human ecology includes both internal and external mechanisms gives it a unique dimension, which also includes another very important aspect, that is a psychological dimension to it. So when we look at it, we actually, when we put all these ideas together, what we see is that the human ecology perspective to any discourse on the place of humans or human beings itself deals with the social aspect, the physical aspect, and the psychological aspect. So there is something called, the evolution happens in many different ways. In one way, it is more functional. So that the connection between the physical and the social is enabled at core by the biological evolution itself, which gives the functional capabilities as a growth collective to see how well actually the resources, or how well evolved the community is, or how well it is grown, or it has grown. So here the evolution is more functional in nature. But if we look at what leads to this functional evolution, is more of a structural evolution, whereas we also saw in the example of brain capacity development, the biological processes dominate and bridge the physical evolution with the psychological evolution to what we can term as a trait collective, which gives humans their own unique identity. Here, the evolution is more structural, and the structural evolution leads humans to gain the functionality traits of how well enabled they are to understand or place themselves in an environment or an ecosystem. But more importantly, the biological evolution also within its domains includes the social and the psychological aspects, which actually lead to what are known as the organizational evolution, how well human communities organize themselves in terms of resource usage, in terms of nurturing, in terms of growth, progress, development in different dimensions. Here, the biological processes facilitate the kind of social and psychological evolution, which we term as the organizational evolution. This is very, very important, especially from the resilience perspective, to know how well nurtured a given population can be to carry forward the functional components and the structural components with the growth collective and the trait collective forward, where it can, several generations can inherit these properties together. And as organized community, they can take forward challenges with a set of experiences that they have gone through together or through several generations to build what is known as the resilience collective. So this is very important for us to understand that human ecology is based on three different aspects: the growth collective, the resilience collective, and the trait collective, which are actually interlinked, also to the processes of functional, organizational, and structural evolution. So this forms the basic idea of understanding what is the unique place of humans with respect to the environment. So human ecology actually is very much biological in one sense, as it is social or abiological, especially structural or physical in one sense, and psychological in another sense. So now, let us, having understood these concepts, let us now look at some photographs. As we move along, I'm going to stop for a few minutes with each of these photographs, and I want you all to reflect on these photographs and note down your observations with respect to some points. So 4 important points that we should understand and reflect upon is: what are the prevalent conditions which are shown in each of these photographs? How humans are using these spaces, and are these spaces or ecosystems, or are they just resource bases in one sense? And which of these can be good dwelling places for humans, and why? Okay, so this actual exercise will help us to understand the types of concepts in human evolution that we have been discussing right now. So let us start looking at these photographs. This is photograph number 1. You see, this is a pristine environment from Meghalaya in India. It's a riverine environment. Humans are using this space in a very harmonious way, probably because they are actually liking the way in which they are interacting with nature in this particular setting. And in turn, what do they give to the nature is one question that we should be understanding. So is this place an ecosystem? Would we call this an ecosystem? Because are humans interacting with this ecosystem? How are they interacting if they are? And how has that impacted this ecosystem? Please take a look at how you can admire the pristineness of this environment and how well this makes an impact on the humans themselves. So moving on, We go to the next photograph now. So this photograph is of Agatti in Lakshadweep. Okay, so here you can see that the pristineness is just carried forward in its scale. What we saw on a smaller scale, we are seeing it in a massive scale here. So there is the blueness of the oceans. We can see that the shallower, there is a distinction between shallow sea and the deep sea. You can see that, you know, there is a nice island in between, and between the shallow sea at the center, you can see that there is a runway. Okay, so there are no humans in this picture, but the you know, the legacy of humans is seen very much in this picture. We can see that there are pristine beaches, probably, you know, the more beautiful to look at from the ground level, as beautiful as they are to look at synoptically from a higher elevation. We can see that this sort of, you know, in the earlier picture, we saw that there were humans who were enjoying the environment by going boating. Here you can see that there is a much larger discourse about tourism here. It is not just ecotourism on a small scale, but it could be ecotourism on a larger scale, because that is why these infrastructures have been created. You can see that there are very less population in this place, but the beauty of the nature is still preserved. So in this way, we can see that, you know, this Lakshadweep Islands here itself, they correspond to some sort of pristineness at a macro scale, and how humans have interacted with a macro scale ecosystem is also evident from this picture. Now, if we see another picture, this is a different narrative of the same thing. We saw that, you know, in the first two pictures, humans interacted in more, I would say, an aesthetic approach to environment. But here the connection seems more deep. You can see this person right in between all this froth and foam let out into Yamuna River, all because of the industrial waste entering the river, but he's still deep with his own religious practice. So what does environment mean to him? Is it a cultural space, or how has he actually looked at this ecosystem? Does he see pristineness? Does he see pollution? Or doesn't see pollution? Or does he just look at it as sort of a cultural space or a religious space, which is beyond the, you know, the confines of what human activities have done to this very space? How is it possible actually for humans to transcend this? So there is some level of consciousness which is evident. We should say that it's an extra consciousness that is evident from this very picture. And it's a very, very powerful picture. It tells the story of how other humans have interacted with nature in some ways, and how some others look at it in a different way and interact with it in a different way. Now, if we move on to another picture here, this is actually a picture from Ulsur Lake in Bangalore. Here you can see that there is massive fish kill, and that fish kill was because of excessive pollution of this lake. This continues to be a problem here, but it is also, you know, managed to a great extent by the civic authorities here, who allow the general public to use this space for boating. But you can see that there are other fringe community members who live around these lakes, who use the lake services for other purposes as well. For example, here they're trying to find live fishes. Yeah, they are fishermen who are trying to have their livelihoods, build their livelihoods around this lake, and they're trying to find live fishes among all the dead fish which is floating. And all this fish kill is attributed to pollution, especially plastic waste pollution, as is evident from this picture. So here, it may not be more of a cultural association that these humans have with the environment. It is more of an economy-based relationship that they are having. But how important is this to them, right? Because some years before, you can see that this picture from the same Ulsur Lake, places it as the center of cultural and social spaces in Bangalore. And these temples continue to occupy the cultural landscape of this lake even today. Okay, so there are many temples around this area, which has been developed and continues to be the center of activity for many other human beings. So now we can see that there is a socio-cultural connection and there is an economic connection. There is also an environmental connection, and these connections basically stem from how humans look at environment in very different ways or very different perspectives. So having looked at these pictures, we can say that humans, they identify themselves with some particular habitats or dwellings, but these habitats or dwellings are defined in different ways, mostly as an individual's, a group's, a family's, or a collective's sense of belonging, right? But this belonging, what is expected of this belonging is that it is the most probable or usual place for them to rest or inhabit, to nourish, which is very important, and to reproduce, which is the same space that the humans share with non-humans. So humans particularly have a refined sense of these conditions. They try to make use or rather, make sense of these spaces in different ways, and which the factors or the constraints which help them to look at it in a different way is first a behavioral choice of how they are looking at the environment and how they are actually connecting with the environment. There is a social choice aspect to it as to how they deal with what they look at or how they inhabit. There is a physiological status of how well the environment and humans are integrated together and how well they can achieve the benefits of rest, nourish, and reproduce. And there is a neurological selectivity aspect to how they look at, does pollution impact everybody or just some? Even despite pollution, we saw in the case of Yamuna River, that person continues to undergo his religious duties, right? He takes up his religious activities forward. So there is a neurological selectivity to understand the concept of dwelling or habitat itself. And of course, genetics plays a role in how well a person can be placed within a given habitat and use it for his or own resources. Most importantly, what is transmitted or transformed, what has transformed a human being in one generation can impact or be transmitted to the next generation in terms of what are known as environmental and social memories. So if we look at a fig tree, which is near our house, we have looked at it in childhood and we have wondered at it, we carry forth with us a sort of a social and an environmental memory of that particular tree in our age and our times, which will stay with us, and we may talk about it, write about it, or discuss about this at different ways with our own generation and the next generation. And this will the social memory builds of this particular fig tree. Similarly, having an ecosystem, a lake ecosystem in a place which has long disappeared, there are people who go up to the lake ecosystems and say there was a lake here, but now it is no longer evident. But they have that environmental and social memory of ecosystems or the ecological habitats at large. So the concept of dwelling, as we see here, is a very complex phenomenon and is very central to understanding human ecology itself. Now let us look at three different considerations that we think about in terms of the functional aspects. So the first aspect is that these relationships or these memories or the identities that humans have with the ecological units would lead either to preservation or loss of ecosystem services. This we should agree. A good example is that conventional infrastructure and lifestyles have become both the forcing factors and the proximate causes, which change the way in which the ecosystem services are being used. So whether it can stabilize or destabilize depends on how this is used. So it can actually impact the society and impact the environment in many different ways. It can be forcing factor, which cause changes in the ecosystem characteristics under normal and altered states. And how activities become forcing factors. For example, we have precipitation, temperature, wind, nutrients. These are the basic forcing factors, amplified by human interaction with these factors, which cause secondary pollution or non-circular consumption. These are examples which cause the primary forcing factors to be in an altered state as secondary forcing factor, which impact it deleteriously, but actually, in actual sense, they may be beneficial to the way that human habitats are actually formed. Another way to look at it is through the proximate causes concept. We have read about this earlier, and we've gone through at great length discussions about proximate causes themselves, and we know that these are actually the causes or factors that cause considerable alteration from the ambient state. For example, urbanization, the process of urbanization itself, the process of groundwater extraction, another example, the increase in the impervious surface areas. These are all actually proximate causes which cause a shift or in the state from an ambient state to an altered state. So these three perspectives together now define where the human environment relationships are going towards or are moving towards. Now let us examine in a very interesting way, what actually is the space of humans in terms of ecological space. So now if we characterize human populations living in different spaces, we can characterize them, as you can see in the first column, as urban population. There can be what are known as hyper-urban population or hyper-endemic urban populations. There can be rural populations. There can be suburban populations. And of course, another category of humans who are tribal, native islanders, forest dwellers, or nomads. So if we look at the specific habitats of these organisms, niches and habitats, it's very interesting to see where they live, right? The urban mostly live in apartments, in multi-storage structures, in houses, it can be independent houses, or it can be having one or two stories, two-story structures probably. So these are places or niches where usually humans are found, but they live as a locality or a community, as a community living space in localities or streets, if we will call, or regions or wards, which is a geographic way of looking at how these distinguished habitats evolve in an urban setting. They can also be industrial societies or industrial townships. It can be beaches, it can be slums. So these are all very different specific habitats for urban population. If we see, this is an interesting evolution from the urban population, which is the hyper urban population or hyper endemic. These are coming up of late. People who live in apartments or bungalows or field stations, especially, they have some gated community spaces which provide all their lifestyle infrastructures to them within the gated community itself. So these are actually specialized habitats that humans try to inhabit. And there are actually places which are more specialized in nature, like the laboratories or the spaces where which is dedicated to scientific research or industrial research or some sort of scientific and industrial activities. So here this becomes what are known as hyper endemic urban spaces, which are more specialized environments. So here actually, if we see, humans have a distinct profile in terms of urban and hyper-urban. In terms of rural populations, we know that they live in houses or farms or huts or in the villages, and the localities or the communities are mostly agrarian-based communities, which also form the basis of the agrarian societies and the maximum population in India. Between this rural and the urban, there is the space of the suburban or the rurban, as it's being called. Here again, the communities, they can be classified as in a different way. Their habitats can be called as inland communities in close association with urban, where actually the urban spaces or the urban lifestyles influence more of the living spaces and the human relationships in the suburban region. So here we see, there is another specialized combination, which is actually in terms of lifestyle and use of resources more urban, but in terms of geography and placement, this is more rural in nature. And we have the tribal or the native islanders group who live in actually temporary locations, in dwellings, in caves, in forests, maybe even field sites, and they move on. So these are actually places which are very much in association with nature. So the degree in which nature becomes part of human culture or human lifestyle and human existence actually increases as we go from urban to tribal. So this is a very interesting observation that we have made. As an ecological organism or an ecological unit, humans have predators and they have prey. But being on top of the trophic level or the trophic status, humans as tertiary consumers, they have actually many different prey and many different sources of food, and also they have the capability to create new food stores or new food types from the primary food types that they are able to get, or the raw materials that they are able to procure. And the predators also here, you see, are more specialized. When the diet becomes specialized, the predators also become specialized, and they cause multiple complex relationships that the organisms or the humans have with nature. And it is more microbial in nature, if we will see, rather than having a macro scale predator prey relationships. It's more microbial in nature, or more unique in nature that way, because humans also develop internal mechanisms to deal with it. This is where the resilience collective becomes very important. Resilience to diseases, and not just disasters, the natural disasters, but also the internal resilience. So humans have this specialized way of dealing with their environment in manifold circumstances in which they have encountered new or challenging phases of growth. So if we move on, if we look at this particular slide, it is very interesting to see that there are different ways in which, again, there is a competitive or a cooperative element which is present in how they interact with each other, right? So if we see in general here, the urban competitive elements, they are quite different from the rural and the tribal components, right? Here actually the competition is more for societal interactions, where employability is one of the big issues, money is a big issue, the resources the use of resources is a big issue, which also translates into the position in the society, the human society. So that becomes actually the competitive elements which define urban living. But if we see in terms of rural, availability of land resource, or water use, or availability of transportation, availability of power, these become the basis for competitive stress for the rural communities. If we see the suburban, it is more of a mix of both the urban and rural. But if we see the tribal, here the competition is more internal in terms of the group hierarchy or the position within a given community, and also the reproductive strengths within this community. So the competitive stresses, we should understand, even within human communities are different, and this leads to the way in which their association with nature attains either an antagonistic sense or a synergistic sense. So in terms of the antagonistic sense, we see it is common for urban, and it is more pronounced in the case of rural, suburban, and tribal, in terms of actually the stresses that the urban society lays on them. So here actually the feedback becomes more complex as on a higher level. If we see at an antagonistic sense, within the community, the resource usages, the way in which anthropogenic stresses caused due to pollution, these specify the way in which lifestyles change. this use of space is changed, how money is transacted, and all these activities leading to defining the position of humans at home, at community, and at a work level or a career level. These are actually the discourses which are very much prevalent as antagonistic elements within an urban or a hyper-urban space. But the question of gender differentiation, the question of position within the community or the village, that become more important, and the challenges which come with education, that actually add to the antagonistic elements at rural, tribal, and suburban levels. Actually, this is actually the rural communities are actually becoming impacted by the goals or the synergistic and competitive elements of the urban communities as well. That is evident in recent times. There are so many discourses about changes in the social activities or the concepts within a rural setup versus an urban setup. But if we see, it is actually the synergistic elements become quite common across urban, rural, suburban, and the hyperurban spaces. Here, actually, the elements which actually bring synergistic interactions between humans are the same at individual levels, at community levels, and at a higher level, even the government or intergovernmental level. So culture, as we see, or operationalizing the social knowledge becomes very important concepts here, and that will determine how the environmental resources are being used, how there is differentiation of labor, how this actually helps solidify the position of humans within a home or at a community level or at a village level. All these together will determine what is the sustainability perspective that the humans can attribute to their own communities. But if we see this cultural space that man has created and the laws and regulations which he uses to sort of manipulate these cultural and socio-cultural spaces, those have a environmental dimension. Okay, in the case of tribals or native islanders or forest dwellers, here, because of their greater interaction with environment, the minimalism of their lifestyles, this leads to a more dynamic lifestyle scenario for them, more in tune with nature. So there are elements that we know of on one sense, on one aspect, that the development of the culture, development of societal interactions, and development of knowledge bases helps humans to progress in the way that is synergistic to their existence. But also, on the other hand, we see that minimalism or the improving of the environmentalism as such, it also pushes forward many of the narratives which helps the humans being synergistic with their environment. So now if we question what the human from the human ecology aspect itself, how do we analyze the human environment relationship within these different spaces? Now let us take urban space. So relationships can be positive, they can be neutral, or they can be negative. If from our discourse and discussion, we see that largely the human population exerts a more antagonistic approach, and in most times a competitive approach, and which leads to struggle for resources, which leads to constant struggle for attaining the position, the power, then it has minimal positive relationship and more negative relationships. This is also true in case of hyper-urban or hyper-endemic urban. It can be less positive and more negative. But can a neutral state be attained? In urban population, it is possible when the population is higher, there tends to be a distribution or a sense of, a cycle of bringing equity back into equation. But in terms of hyper-endemic urban spaces, where in terms of like a gated community approach, the neutrality in ecological relationships, it is very difficult to achieve that, because it tends to be more of a self-possessed perspective, because this gated community does always need this resource and it will continue to procure it and use it. So there tends to be a more negative relationship as more and more the groups become smaller and there is no interaction with other groups, right? When it becomes more endemic. But in a rural scenario, there is a high possibility of maintaining neutral relationships with more probability for positive relationship whenever there is a strong connection with nature, which actually is a little bit eroded in terms of suburban spaces, as more in terms of tribal or native islanders or forest dwellers spaces where there is more connection with nature. But again, the question of neutral relationships is very much ambiguous even in the last category, because either humans are going to positively impact by their minimalistic lifestyles, or negatively affect by excessive use of resources in one place and then move on to another place. So there are different categories of people having different lifestyle, but it's never going to be neutral, because this sort of feedbacks, if we see between whenever there is endemism or there is a groupism or there is a closure of communication with other groups of humans, we see that human environment human relationship is also as important as human environment relationships. Here what actually is evident is that the management strategies, how humans, each of these human population apply to their environment, that becomes more important. In terms of positive relationship, it will yield positive management scenario. In terms of negative relationship, it will yield to negative management scenario. And overcoming the means to bridge the positive and the negative aspects will help to restore the neutrality to some extent. But it is not always a practical reality that we have to understand. If we look at this perspective that we have developed till now about human ecology and the relationship of humans with environments, we understand this model, what is known as environmental affordances model. So this is a very good way to understand whatever we have been discussing till now. So the environmental affordance model states that environmental affordances and constraints such as opportunities and inflexible barriers promote the particular psychological and behavior responses to stress. So this is a very good way to integrate the ideas that we put forward. In case of, if you remember the triangle that we saw earlier, biology at the center, the physical, the social, and the psychology at the three nodes. This of environmental affordances model exactly says the same thing. It says that there are opportunities and there are inflexible barriers that human communities have to transcend. These actually, the interactions with these opportunities for growth and development, as well as inflexible barriers, because barriers can be flexible and it can be overcome to some extent, but there are inflexible barriers. Probably the highest impact of pollution on an ecosystem which has completely degraded it, that is something that's an inflexible barrier that a human community has to overcome. These actually promote the way in how psychologically and behaviorally they respond to this particular stress, and that actually opens up what are known as the positive or negative socio-economic positions for human beings. Okay, socio-economic positions in human beings of human dwelling area can influence several health related decisions, also the social decisions, through their convergence with both the physical and the social environment. So the concept of humans as in not just actually a bioecological sense, but also as a socio-economic sense, that is very, very important in terms of the socio-economic positions. And balancing such internal and external sustainability components is very important to promote the concept of sustainable development at first, and also to know how much is too much or how much is too less. So this environmental affordances model gives us a good perspective on to identify the opportunities, the inflexible barriers, as well as the socio-economic positions of human beings itself within a given community space or within a given dwelling or a habitat. Now we understand, now moving forward, in theory, human ecology actually touches upon three different perspectives. First is the effects of the ecological position of humans in terms of space and time on the environment itself. The second perspective is that the human institutions and the social connections that the humans have, how they influence their spatial relationships with nature and spatial relationships with their dwelling areas, and how this can lead to changes in the physical nature and the social relationships themselves. The third aspect and the more advanced or evolved aspect of discussing this is the human behavioral aspect, or the how to achieve the environmental outcomes. Here again, the spatial relationships and the social and the political issues associated with these relationships become more the turning point for us to understand this. So actually, these three facets of existences within a given sphere is very important to understand the human beings as products of competition and selection itself, as we have been discussing, and how well the human institutions and the human nature, they tend to accommodate these spatial relationships of human beings with nature. And also, very, very importantly, coming to the point of making the distinction between conscious and unconscious activity that places humans in a unique position compared to other non-humans. So here, whatever decisions that human beings as animals or as communities, as social beings take, it is more of a conscious approach compared to the unconscious approach that the other organisms tend to adopt, because they are just actually responding to an environmental stress. They are not consciously carrying that out, they are responding to it. But humans are actually consciously doing so that they can develop resilience at much faster scales. Now we understand then that human ecology as a functional aspect involves four different aspects of biology, geography, sociology, as well as economics. Biology tells human beings how humans can function as systems together along with the environment. Geography says how they work with these ecosystems. Sociology says how they can organize the working of these systems together. And economics actually dictates how they will use it, or they are using it. Okay, so these three different social forces or non-biological and biological forces together determine humans' position as an ecological animal, right, or an ecological organism. But the pathways are different based on the unique nodes of interaction. So there are three different nodes of interaction. The first node of interaction deals, as we have seen already, with how humans look at the ecosystem services components and where they are placed in terms of their statuses. The second and the most important one are the transitional pathways that humans take. So here, the navigating the nexus between the land and the air and the water and the social land, air, water, and the human communities themselves alongside the social interactions. These become another very, very important pathways to support the economy. So the nexus aspect here is not just humans with land or water as ecosystems or air as ecosystems, but as humans versus ecosystems on the whole also, where the behavioral and the other aspects come into play. And this is what actually creates the sustainable resource basis for development. Here, the concept of sustainable resource basis is very much the most important node of human development itself. And we know that sustainability is very important to support not just the present generation, but also the future generations, because the life supporting capacity of the earth is being stretched, and there's a growing awareness of the environmental problems and socio-economic issues, where social decision making becomes very, very important. So analyzing the human space in the society and analyzing the human space in environment, both are very, very important to achieve the triple bottom line. Now, if we see the question of human ecology, which deals with sustainability at large, actually is defined through three different ways: how humans use natural materials, how land management changes with the use of these materials, and how that brings about the societal changes. So depletion of resources, for example, lays a great stress on the global energy consumption. So these are actually interconnected. For example, it is said that 40% is accounted for by the construction industry itself. Construction industry consumes 40% of the global energy. So here we see that human defining his dwelling in terms of constructed areas or constructions, that actually has the most impact on the way that energy is distributed for the benefit of humans themselves. So now we can see, as humans, the powerful place in the environment is the way in which he amasses not just the energy, but also the land spaces. And this leads to massive change in the land use patterns, which persist over different centuries and different millennia. This, along with the added pressures of pollution, it modifies the resource usage scenarios beyond a certain level itself. And this actually, whether man realizes this or not, it actually has an effect on the social and the ethical values of the community, which inhabit a given space and time, and use these resources on a continual basis. So the question now in the equation of environment-human relationship deals with the question of environment, economy, and equity. So now if we see the four nodes where the environment, economic, and equity are concerned, these are actually largely dictated by another node of activity, which is actually very, very specific to human beings. And we can call that it is a very specialized activity of human communities. It is called engineering, right? Humans have engineered their spaces, or engineered their lifestyles, and engineered their living. So this actually gives rise to different conflicts. As we see here, the conflict of controlling growth, the conflict of resource usage, the conflicts of profitability of the enterprises that he deals with, and conflicts arising due to the access and or marginalization of communities with respect to the access to the resources. So here the questions are also intensified by the problems of pollution and exploitation, and also the class and property consciousness of the different human communities. So this differential accesses and the differential ways in which these conflicts are dealt with, these give rise to the consciousness as a whole that making the best use of resources and space is very much a necessity to avoid these conflicts, which should actually lead to optimization and extraction of resources and their application. And also it should provide a legacy of transformation for the future generation of what worked and did not work, and how humans as a community overcame these challenges in the past. We should now understand that not all challenges can be positively overcome. That is where it leads to our positive relationship with nature or a negative relationship with nature. But as a social mechanism, these get stored in a generational memory as an environmental or a social memory of how these challenges were dealt with. So if we look at this unique stream of engineering and technology, which places humans in a very unique role in on the globe, there can be two different approaches. The first approach, as it is right now, is the business as usual. It's called business as usual approach. It's basically a one-dimensional anthropocentric model where humans as higher trophic organisms keep using the resources. Here, the technological innovations and upgradations are projected as solutions. So with this perspective, humans can think we can fix anything with technology, anything by innovating, right? So, and upgrading as solutions. So it can be possible to achieve environment equity, all the three aspects that we have discussed at large by placing technology at core of all solutions. But it is slowly moving towards what is known nowadays as a systems engineering approach, where the prudent use of resources, bringing down the number of raw materials that go into production or go into engineering lifestyles, these becomes very, very important. So the prudent use of resources are the first step of the systems engineering approach, which also places more stress on economy-centric approach, but with a constraint on harmful emissions or harmful impacts of anthropogenic activities. So it is no longer the one-dimensional anthropocentric view that that is usually prevalent in the human society, but it moves more towards the prudent use of resources scenario. But the challenges come in three different ways. Whenever technology is used, we don't know its impact fully, right? So the inadequate knowledge of the effect of a technological application or a process on the ecological process or maintaining the balance of ecology in the surrounding environment, that is always going to be a challenge, and that is something that humans should look very closely to at very fine details to understand how to fix these without causing huge damage to environment, and also in the stressing more on the micro scale restorative projects than on increasing or multiplying issues which look at large scale restoration activities. So human impact to the environment is a given. It is going to be negative is largely also known, but the inadequate effect of technology versus the ecological balance that need to be approached very, very carefully. The second problem is of determining what would be the best engineering solution to balance both the economy and the ecology. We say that the effect should be minimalistic, but how do we balance this? Because human populations as a whole, whether it be rural, urban or hyper-urban, they all run or depend on economy, and the power of economy, the position that human attains in the society is largely dictated by the larger economy also. So here determining the balance between economy and ecology becomes very important. But in the absence of a reference framework, it becomes even more a bigger issue to deal with. So what is this reference framework? How do we come up with it? This is what is actually unfolding with our generation here. When the question of sustainability is being taken up very, very seriously, we are trying to balance sustainable development within the terms of economy as well as within the terms of environment also. Also, the third issue is scarcity of literature on proper sustainability assessment frameworks themselves. Okay, we now started with minimalistic use, then we moved on to economy and said, okay, now we are in safe zone because we are planning for sustainable development. But do we have a framework for sustainability assessment itself? So those are also unfolding before us these days. We have many international programs. We have intergovernmental panels. We have, large global panels which are looking at biodiversity conservation. They're looking at red list of ecosystems. They're looking at, a macro scale integration of human and environment in very different ways. But the challenge again is to apply all these concepts, all these findings, and all the suggestions or advisories into the practical application sphere. So that actually still exists. So these problems in environment-human interactions become again another core issue or the core focus of the discourse that we are having on the human ecological relationships and human status within the environment. We all know that these sustainable development goals, they have a regulatory effect on the way that they are actually perceived and taken for. And we also have learned together how not all SDG goals can be synergistic. One can cancel out the another, or it can actually benefit another, and it can actually improve on achieving goals together. So the goals, interactions of these goals are also some mechanisms which need to be introspected further. So the regulatory goals of SDGs actually are hinging upon the societal roles as well to many to a greater magnitude, rather than just actually managing the biological or the ecological capacities of the environment. Now we see that as we move towards responsible engineering and responsible impacting of our environment, two different considerations are important from the innovation aspect. Okay, so it can be in terms of design or it can be in terms of the environment. The built environment especially is at the core of this. So growing new and environmental friendly materials, reuse of waste materials, and use of alternate materials, these form one set of or suite of approaches where innovation is being largely taken forth. But in terms that has to catch up with, we have to catch up with as a community, is in terms of the design itself, how the urban planning and regulations operate, and how the small structural planning, what is known as smart engineering, is actually helping to improve the way in which ecosystem services of the natural environment is being used. So here the four nodes of reliability based design, resilience based initiatives, economic or ergonomic designs, and climate sensitive designs. This should become the focus of the engineering or the built environment aspects that the humans inhabit. Now let us take an example. I'm going to show a series of examples to explain all these concepts that we have been looking at, so that we get better understanding of what we are talking about. Let us analyze an example of how technology basis can help to actually reuse materials in a very harmonious way. Here you see that the construction wastes, okay, the geotechnical waste, the construction waste, which may be otherwise be hazardous, they can be beneficially used as secondary filling materials for pavement bases. There have been organizations recently, NERI organized a series of talks where a central government organization dealing with these innovations, they showed how effectively they can be used as secondary paving materials, and through recycling of glass crushed and rock blended materials which come from various industrial activities, they can also be used as filling materials here. So the concept that it is possible for us to recycle and reuse and judiciously use what is termed as waste in one sense is a very good concept. But our attention should also be on the resource economics aspect of this. Is it actually a profitable venture, or is it a sustainably profitable venture? That is a more important thing, because if it is not sustainable, then it will not be carried forth. Also, what is the energy consumption aspect of this recycling process itself? So this in a way is a practical application of all the the innovative or the engineering aspects that humans have learned to deal with nature, how to practically use this. Even if we have created waste and reused them, will it still be a practicable venture in terms of the energy consumption, in terms of the resource economics concept? So it is something that we have to actually look closely into. So there are multiple solutions that technology, science, and engineering can offer to the society. But is it going to be beneficial on a larger scale for a longer period of time? And is it going to be a sustainable venture? Another example is the use of pulverized fly ash to improve the thermal properties of energy piles. Okay, this actually can also become shredded. Another example is recycling of shredded scrap tires as lightweight fill materials. Both fly ash as well as the scrap tires together can also be used for paving. Okay, so it's not just the construction materials we saw. This can be very viable means, because here actually the energy consumption can be different, even lower if in some cases, to use these kind of alternatives. But will it still give the tensile strength or the structural strength for the roads to hold? Will there not be caving in? So all these aspects are very, very important. Here you see a SEM image of how the fly ash can improve the energy properties of the energy piles themselves. They are very closely spaced, and the energy consumption can be less to excite them for there will be very less energy which is required for them to integrate together and actually give the structural compactness that is required as fill materials. But if we use, on other hand, to construct this as basis for bioengineered slope, there can be also the use of recycled mixed glass and plastic segments to construct for construction purposes itself, as wall units, etc. These are also possibilities which are being explored, where the energy consumption aspect can be much lesser than for the other use that they are actually thinking about right now. So there are, what I'm trying to say is, there are multiple ways to use wastes, and there are multiple energy use scenarios and resource economic scenarios. These all have to be assessed before being used, the waste to be put to best use. So the best use scenario is one which will demand less of resources again, to convert it from the waste status to something useful. So that actually becomes the mantra, or the basic way in which how humans can process the waste and convert it into resource. Another way to look at it is to actually pave the built spaces around impermeable surfaces in a way which makes them become permeable. One good example is the use of what is known as the permeable pavement concept around urban lake ecosystems, which will allow for actually filtration of the waters, as well as retain the water and let it flow into the lake because of the permeability component. Here we see it is not just planning for the or an engineering solution. Okay, it is not just an engineering solution, or it is not just a technological solution to manage the runoff, the pollution from runoff into the lake, but it is also an integrated solution along with maintaining the ecological integrity of the lake ecosystem itself. So the integration of the cooperative strengths and disciplines will actually increase the synergistic impacts that technology and engineering and science has on improving the environmental quality itself. So at the node again of the human environment relationship is the synergistic relationships that have to be fostered. And we also have to understand that this can fail at any point in time. If it fails, replanning and redevelopment of solution becomes very, very necessary. And this have to be always taken into account when the initial plans are made. So there has to be not just a plan A, but there has to be a plan B and a plan C, which will lead to more sustainable management of resources, along with sustainable management of the resource basis, that is the ecosystems themselves. This is very, very important for us to preserve the ecosystem services. Other examples, as you see here, having sky lighting, having intuitive HVAC system or natural lighting. This will be very, very important part of the of a built environment concept, which is actually progressing even to the rural environments right now. So here actually promoting easy wind and light circulation and decreasing energy consumption, this becomes a core from the small dwelling unit concept itself. So from there, this gets magnified, and this can also lead to effective way to manage urban heat island stress in many ways. Use of what are known as bioretention swales and constructed wetlands. So these can be very specific construction based or technology based or engineering based measures to collect rainwater, excess runoff, and offer what is known as flood protection. So these we have seen that there can be artificial water systems. These form the part of artificial water systems without actually compromising on the ecological integrity or the functionalities of the natural systems with which they are interconnected with. So here the treatment of the biological treatment in secondary, tertiary treatment options that can also be facilitated along with storage of excessive floodwaters. So this is another example of urban or hyperurban environments where solutions can be engineered, or it can be environment-based solutions rather, to help to manage the negative aspects of the interactions of humans with their environments. A very good way, which is also coming up these days, is what are known as biophilic buildings. I will show an example just a few minutes later. But what it actually means is to have multi-compartmental nature-based living spaces or working spaces, which will improve the integration of the human spaces with the environment. So this concept is a more advanced and a far-fetching concept, which actually, pulls back, as we saw that humans lose connection with nature, the antagonistic elements increase and the synergistic components decrease, the competitive elements increase, and the cooperative elements decrease. But with biophilic buildings concept, this is actually being forged. Okay, the relationship between human and environment can be forged. It can also help to mitigate the heat island effect, regulate energy consumption, and build flood resilient landscapes. This is the example I was talking about. There is actual evidence that this can happen. This is the diagram which is shown here, the photographs here, they are of biophilic building, which was constructed by Titan in Bangalore. It is in a space called Mindscape. It is based on the biophilic construction technique or methodology. As you can see, the green spaces actually surround externally as well as internally within the the building itself. And there are several designs here which you can see, which bring nature at the core of human existence itself. So what is primary to this is realization that the needs for human population at a primary level is to have a lung space or the greens, and have flood and heat resilience in terms of the blues. So this is actually the concept core to a dwelling or a habitat. And the goal is to build positive and sustainable human environment relationships using these understanding and using several engineering and technological advancements. So with this, I stop my presentation today. And I think we still have some time left today to take some questions, and be happy to do that. Thank you for looking and giving your attention to these